There's a certain kind of story that doesn't just ask you to watch it, it dares you to sit with it, to feel every bruise, every stolen glance, every lie told, for the greater good, and then asks you quietly, almost cruelly, what would you have done in their place? And Pengganti Tiga Tahun is exactly that kind of story. A slow-burning Indonesian melodrama that wraps itself around the idea of sacrifice and identity until you can't tell where a duty to family ends and the destruction of self begins, and from the very first minutes of the pilot, you know you're not just watching a love story, you're watching a countdown, a 3-year ticking time bomb built on a replacement bride, a twin who isn't supposed to exist, and a marriage that was never meant to be real but somehow becomes the most painfully real thing in these characters' lives. Before we dive into all of that, though, and really peel open this show layer by layer, before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments, because this is the kind of series that turns into a debate, and I genuinely want to know from which part of the world you're feeling these emotions, because even if the language is Indonesian and the customs are tied deeply into that culture, the heartbeat of this show is universal, and it hits in a way that feels uncomfortably close to home no matter where you are from. So let's settle in. Imagine the screen fading from black to the first shot, and talk about Pengganti Tiga Tahun like we just watched it together in silence, and now we finally get to exhale and unpack everything that just happened to us for the last, 10 episodes of emotional warfare masquerading as romance. This 2025 release arrives at an interesting moment for Indonesian dramas, where streaming platforms are hungry for high-concept plots. K-dramas have set the global bar for intense, beautifully shot melodrama, and audiences have grown used to love stories that are not just boy meets girl, but boy meets girl under a contract signed in blood, and Pengganti Tiga Tahun fits right into that lane, but in a way that still feels distinctly local, grounded in Jakarta's social hierarchies, the quiet pressure of family reputation, and the sense that your last name can be both a shield and a weapon. The title itself, Pengganti Tiga Tahun, already tells you a story before the first scene even begins, replacement for 3 years, with that stylized Tiga that sounds like Tiga, but also feels like a name, like something personal folded into a number, and that duality is everywhere in the show, this idea that something can be two things at once, Salma and Sarah, wife and stranger, love and cruelty, punishment and protection. And when you learn that the core premise revolves around Salma Julia stepping into her twin sister Sarah's place to marry into the Peter family and save the fragile, long-standing relationship between two powerful households, you instantly know, this is not going to end cleanly. This is not a story where everyone walks away thanking each other for their sacrifices. Instead, it's about the scars left behind when people treat a human being like a placeholder, a living, breathing stand-in for a promise made on paper. Now the series was promoted heavily in early 2025 across Indonesian social media. Hyped as a tragic romance with a twist, banners emblazoned with the faces of the lead actors looking like they were sharing a wedding portrait and a mugshot at the same time, and early interviews with the cast hinted that it would not be comfortable to watch, that we would probably hate some of them, and that if at any point we felt conflicted, the show had done its job. And watching it week to week, you could see that promise play out in the discourse, because every episode drop turned into threads arguing whether Salma was too self-sacrificing, whether Chris Peter was redeemable or just broken beyond repair, and whether Sarah had the right to reclaim the life she walked away from. And that kind of reaction only happens when the writing hits somewhere deep and messy. But let's start at the beginning, with the premise as the show gently, almost deceptively, unfolds it. We meet Salma Julia in a way that almost tricks you into thinking this is her story alone, an ordinary, slightly introverted woman living quietly in the shadow of a twin sister who has always been brighter, louder, more desired. And from the very first scene, Salma doesn't feel like a cliché, nice girl, lead. She feels like someone who has spent her whole life learning how to take up less space so that other people can shine. And that context becomes crucial when she is asked to do the unthinkable, step into her twin sister's shoes and marry Chris Peter, the fiancé who believes he's marrying Sarah. The show doesn't jump into that immediately, though, and that's one thing I loved about the pacing of the early episodes, that it takes its time to show us the dynamics within the Julia family, the weight of their financial dependency on the Peter empire, the genteel but suffocating lunches where every word is measured, and Salma's role within it all, the daughter who listens more than she speaks, the one their mother looks at with a kind of painful gratitude that already hints at what she's about to ask. When the crisis hits, that Sarah runs away, that Sarah cannot, will not go through with the arranged marriage that's supposed to stabilize both families economically and socially. It plays out not as a dramatic screaming match, but as this horrifying, quiet emergency in a living room where everybody is talking over each other except Salma, who is sitting with this storm building inside her because you can see she already knows what they're going to ask her before the words are even spoken, when the mother, with trembling hands, reaches for Salma and asks her to help, to take Sarah's place, just for a while, until they can sort things out. You watch every moral line blur in her eyes, and the beauty of the way this is written is that Salma does not agree in some noble, self-sacrificial speech. She doesn't say, "I'll do it for the family." She hesitates, she almost refuses, she struggles, but the years of being the reliable child, the one who fixes things quietly, the one who doesn't cause trouble, they all culminate in this moment, and when she finally whispers that she'll do it, it's not triumphant, it's a surrender, and from this surrender the whole tragedy unfolds. The wedding sequence is where the cinematography really makes its first statement, because on the surface it looks like your typical lavish Indonesian wedding, gold motifs, floral arrangements, guests shimmering in traditional attire, but the camera keeps isolating Salma, pushing in on her eyes above the bridal veil, catching the way her hand trembles slightly when Chris Peter takes it in front of everyone, and in these tight shots you feel just how alone she is in this crowded spectacle, especially because Chris believes she is Sarah, the woman who allegedly betrayed everything he stands for and then came back only because she had to. It's not fully spelled out in the first episode, but there's a history between Chris Peter and the idea of Julia that's already sour, old business deals, old misunderstandings, gossip about the twins' reputation, and he's entering this marriage not with love, but with this cold, resigned anger, and that's what makes their first night together so devastating to watch, not because something explicit happens, but because emotionally, the violence has already begun. One of the smartest choices the show makes is not to make Chris some cartoonish abuser from the jump, but a man so numbed and twisted by his sense of duty and disappointment that his cruelty comes out in these bristling, casual remarks, in the way he doesn't look at her when he speaks, in how he orders staff around her as if she's an object being transported from room to room. And there's this moment in their wedding suite where Salma, still in her gown, tries to break the tension with a simple, "Thank you for today," and Chris, without even turning around fully, just mutters, "I didn't do this for you, Sarah." And you watch Salma flinch not only because of the harshness of the words, but because of the name, Sarah, a reminder that she is, in his eyes, an imposter, but also a scapegoat, and that double layer hits you hard as a viewer. And this is where we have to talk about how the show handles the mistaken identity trope, because usually in dramas like this, there's a kind of romantic suspense built around when the truth will come out, but Pengganti Tiga Tahun complicates it by making Salma's transformation into Sarah something that everyone in the Julia household agreed to, something premeditated and polished, with forged documents, rehearsed mannerisms, and a terrifying scene where her mother removes Salma's old necklace and replaces it with the one Sarah used to wear, saying, "For 3 years, you are her," as if you can just overwrite a person like changing a file name. And that chilling ritual is what makes every interaction between Salma and Chris carry so much tension, because as an audience, you know the entire foundation of this relationship is not just a lie, it's a sacrifice that nobody plans to acknowledge. In the early stretch of the series, the honeymoon phase is basically non-existent, replaced by a hostile cohabitation inside the cold luxury of the Peter mansion, which the cinematographer frames almost like a prison: long hallways, reflective floors, glass walls that show the outside world but feel unbreakable, and wide shots where Salma is the only living thing in a frame of expensive furniture and soulless modern decor. And through this visual language you sense how she's disappeared into a role the way someone disappears into a big, empty house. Now, from a review standpoint, what really struck me about these episodes is how the show never lets Salma's quietness be mistaken for passivity. She is not some endlessly forgiving saint, she's just been conditioned to survive through endurance, and we see it in the small ways she adapts, waking up earlier than everyone else to learn the household routines, taking the brunt of Chris's sharp words but allowing herself to cry only in the one safe space she finds, which hilariously at first is the bathroom, the most private corner left to her, and then later, the little balcony outside the guest room where she can see the city lights and remember there's a world beyond this arrangement. It's on that balcony where we get one of the first signs that Chris is not entirely made of ice, when he finds her there late at night, barefoot in the cold, having escaped the unbearable silence of their bedroom, and instead of yelling, he just stands there, irritated but also vaguely concerned. and throws a blanket over her shoulders without meeting her eyes before walking off, and this tiny act of unspoken care becomes, for us, a crack in his armor, a hint that the man he is now is a distorted version of someone who once had the capacity for gentleness, perhaps long before this marriage of convenience turned his life into a political transaction, and from that tiny crack, the series slowly, painfully, starts pushing at both of them, forcing them to confront the roles they are playing, and this is where I want to pause and talk about the performances, because this story lives or dies on whether we believe these characters, and the cast really bring it. The actress playing Salma and Sarah has the unenviable task of making identical twins feel like two completely different people, even when others on screen can't tell them apart, and she pulls it off with this incredible control over her physicality. You can tell when it's Salma pretending to be Sarah, not because of her clothes or hair, but because of how she holds her shoulders, slightly tense, as if she's wearing something that doesn't quite fit, whereas when the show flashes back to Sarah in home videos or old memories, Sarah's body language is looser, more impulsive, her laughter just that bit louder, and this contrast becomes even more striking in the later episodes when the real Sarah returns and stands next to Salma, forcing us to confront them as two women who made two very different choices with the same face. On the other side, the actor playing Chris Peter gives us a man who could have easily slipped into the territory of pure villain, but instead is portrayed as someone whose cruelty is born out of a lifetime of pressure, betrayal, and unhealed wounds, and the script takes its time unpacking that, showing us a father who never gave him unconditional love, only expectations, a family legacy built on keeping up appearances at all costs, and a series of business deals with the Julia family that left him feeling played and used, so that by the time he's forced into this marriage, he's already decided that his heart is off limits, and the tragedy for us as viewers is watching that decision slowly crumble in the most painful way possible. Now structurally, the show is split into two major timelines, the present 3-year marriage and the events that led up to it, and the post-marriage fallout when Salma leaves and Sarah returns. And I think the writers made a smart move by not rushing to that 3-year time jump, instead letting us marinate in the hellish, complicated rhythm that forms between Salma and Chris as they navigate being husband and wife in public and strangers in private. There's the office scenes where Chris brings Sarah along to corporate dinners, and you see Salma quietly observing business talk she barely understands but trying her hardest to play the part, whispering soft apologies when she missteps. And there's this one excruciating dinner with a potential investor who jokes crudely about arranged marriages and says something like, "At least you got the pretty one," and Chris, instead of defending her, laughs it off stiffly and changes the subject, later telling Salma in the car that in their world, sometimes you just have to endure things, oblivious to the bitter irony that she's been enduring him this entire time, but slowly, through mutual proximity and tiny moments of accidental intimacy, the ice begins to crack, and as a viewer you can feel yourself succumbing to the dangerous hope that maybe, just maybe, they could turn this nightmare into something softer. One of the standout episodes centers around an unexpected illness. Salma catches a bad fever after staying out in the rain trying to help a lost child find his mother, and Chris, who initially dismisses her concerns as overly emotional, comes home late to find her half-conscious on the sofa, cheeks flushed, murmuring fragments of Sarah's name and 3 years in her sleep, and in that moment, something in him snaps away from anger and into panic. The camera lingers on his face as he kneels beside her, and for the first time his voice cracks as he calls for help, lifts her up, presses a hand to her forehead, and when the doctor leaves and the crisis passes, we see him sitting by her bedside all night, watching her breathe, asking himself questions the script doesn't need him to say out loud. Because you can see it in the way his expression shifts from resentment to this fragile confusion. Who is this woman really, and why has she never defended herself or fought back the way that Sarah, in his head, always did? That's where the writing cleverly plants seeds of doubt in Chris, small inconsistencies he starts to notice, like Salma's different taste in music, the way she prefers quiet corners over the center of the room, the fact that she doesn't remember specific events they supposedly shared in the past, and you, as the audience, are almost screaming, he's going to figure it out, he's going to realize she's not Sarah. But the show keeps pulling back, reminding you, the contract, the families, the threats hanging over Salma's head if she exposes the lie, so she keeps twisting herself into knots trying to explain things away, while Chris keeps oscillating between suspicion and a strange growing tenderness that he can't justify if he still believes she's the woman who once hurt him. And let's talk about that hurt, because the Sarah of the past is not simply a villain either. She's painted as a woman who refused to be a pawn, who walked out of the engagement because she wanted to own her life, her choices, and in many ways she's the catalyst for all of this, the one who said no, and the entire world punished her sister instead. The show reveals through flashbacks that Sarah and Chris once had the potential for a very different kind of relationship. There were hints of chemistry, moments of vulnerability, but things soured when business tensions exploded between their families, and Sarah, chafing at being treated like decorative leverage, lashed out, said cruel things, disappeared when she was needed most, and in that chaos, Chris locked his heart away and turned the idea of Sarah Julia into a symbol of everything that betrayed him. What's fascinating is that the series doesn't excuse Sarah's actions, but it contextualizes them, making it impossible to hate her outright even when you want to blame someone for what Salma is enduring, and this complexity is what makes the later episodes, when Sarah finally returns, so emotionally volatile. But before we even get there, we have to talk about the 3-year promise, because that's the engine driving the entire first half of the narrative, Salma's understanding that she is to hold this life together for 3 years and then disappear, so that whatever deal was struck between Julia and Peter stays intact, debts are settled, reputation saved, and she leaves with nothing but her memories and her scars. It's stated very clearly to her, there is no future for you here, you are temporary, a living contract term with a countdown, and this sense of looming expiration hangs over every episode like a shadow, a constant reminder that however close she and Chris might accidentally become, there is an endpoint written in ink that she has promised not to fight. So when the show finally moves into year 2 and then year 3 of the marriage, it does so with a subtle shift in tone, the initial hostility between them softening into this uneasy peace, then something approaching companionship, and maybe, just maybe, something like love, although neither of them dares to name it. There's this beautiful, quiet sequence where a storm knocks out the electricity in the mansion, forcing everyone to huddle in candlelight, and Chris and Salma find themselves in the kitchen, their staff gone home early, trying to make instant noodles by phone torch, and they end up laughing as they burn the first attempt, bumping into each other in the dark, and for a few seconds, you see who they could have been if none of this had started with lies, just two people figuring things out together. In that candlelight, their faces look softer, less haunted, and Chris tells a story about his late mother, how she would make noodles for him on nights when his father kept him at the office too late, and you see Salma listening not as Sarah, not as the wife he resents, but as herself. Salma, the girl who understands loneliness all too well, and in that shared silence, the emotional distance between them shrinks. From a reviewer's standpoint, scenes like this are where the series shines the brightest, because they are not big, flashy confrontations, they are the quiet intimacy that makes the later heartbreak absolutely brutal, because you've seen how real and gentle they can be when the world isn't watching, and then, inevitably, the clock runs out, because the series is framed around that 3-year mark. And the 3rd year brings with it a sense of finality that Salma can feel even in her bones. She starts packing little by little, discarding clues of her existence so that the leave-taking will be clean, and every time she folds a dress or sets aside a book, you can see the way her fingers linger, as if she's touching the life she never truly owned. She's completed her mission, kept the families aligned, done everything that was asked of her, but the price has been losing herself in someone else's name, and the night she finally leaves, it's done in this heartbreaking, unspectacular way. No grand fight, no melodramatic slap scene, just a single, final breakfast where she watches Chris read the business pages like always, memorize the outline of his face in the morning light, and then, when he leaves for the office, she goes to their room, picks up her small suitcase, and walks out of a life that never gave her the words she needed him to say. The show makes a powerful choice here by not having her confront him at the moment of departure, because that's exactly who Salma is, someone who loves loudly inside but moves quietly outside, and as viewers, you almost feel betrayed for her, like you want her to smash something, to scream, but the way she leaves is exactly what gives the story its haunting quality. When Chris returns that evening to find the wardrobe half empty and the house strangely echoing, his realization unfolds slowly, then hits like a physical blow when he discovers that she's left behind a letter, not addressed to Chris, but to Mr. Peter, filled with formal gratitude, polite distance, and a single line that kills you: "My time is over, thank you for letting me stay," which reads more like a note from a guest house tenant than a wife. And in that single sentence you feel 3 years of unsaid feelings. Now, Chris's reaction here is crucial to whether audiences feel he has any chance at redemption, and the actor absolutely nails it. He doesn't rage immediately. He doesn't go into some melodramatic outburst. Instead you see this dawning horror on his face as he starts piecing together odd moments, her strange questions about the future, the way she'd sometimes look at him like she was memorizing him, and we get a gut-punch flashback montage of all the times she asked indirectly about what happens next, and how he always brushed it off, assuming they would simply continue indefinitely because he'd grown used to her presence, never bothering to imagine that she had an expiration date. And that's when it hits him. He never really tried to know her, he only slowly, reluctantly fell in love with the idea of this softer, humbler Sarah, without realizing she was a completely different person. The truth about her identity comes crashing down not through some dramatic confrontation, but through Sarah herself, and this is where the series shifts gears into its second major movement. After Salma leaves, the real Sarah Julia returns to the picture, not as a ghost from the past, but as a very real woman walking into the Peter offices with the confidence that once made her so unbearable to them all, and her arrival scene is staged almost like a heist. The camera following her high heels cutting through the sterile lobby, employees staring, whispers along the corridors, and then the elevator doors sliding open to reveal her standing in front of Chris's office like some kind of reckoning. When Chris looks up and sees Sarah, the shock is visceral, because for him, this is impossible. His wife has just left, the woman he spent 3 years with, and now the woman who shares that face is standing before him, carrying herself differently, eyes sharper, posture fearless, and in his confusion and anger, he demands an explanation, which Sarah, with that signature Julia bluntness, finally delivers. It was never me, she says. It was Salma, my twin, the one who did what I refused to do, the one who married you and bore the weight of our family's lies so that I could run from it all. And this scene, in terms of acting and emotional impact, is one of the best in the whole series, because you watch Chris cycle through disbelief, denial, rage, and then something that looks a lot like grief, all within a few minutes, as he realizes that every moment of kindness he showed in those later years, every laugh, every brief touch, they weren't shared with the woman he thought, but with someone he never even tried to truly see. The way the show handles the fallout from this revelation is interesting because it doesn't instantly turn into a desperate chase after Salma. Instead, it sits with Chris's shock and guilt, forcing him to look at his own behavior through the lens of the truth. And that's where the series' commentary on emotional abuse really lands. We see him replaying his cruelties in his mind, the cold words, the nights he ignored her, the times he used her as a shield in public but never offered protection in private, and now that he knows she was Salma, the quieter twin, the one who never hurt him, those memories become unbearable, and you can almost feel the audience collectively shifting, re-evaluating whether we're ready to watch this man seek redemption or whether we believe some doors, once closed, should stay closed. While Chris sinks into his own personal purgatory, the show pivots to Salma's life after leaving, and this is where the tone changes significantly, almost like stepping out of a suffocating house into fresh air, except the fresh air is unfamiliar, and Salma has to learn how to breathe it. She's moved away from Jakarta, taken a job in a smaller city, and the color palette of the cinematography shifts from the stark, polished blues and grays of the Peter mansion to warmer, earthier tones, markets bustling with life, small cafes, tree-lined streets, and visually, you feel this sense of emotional reset. She cuts her hair in one small but symbolically huge scene, staring at herself in the mirror not as Sarah, not as Mrs. Peter, but as Salma, and the first time she introduces herself with her real name to a stranger, you feel this quiet triumph, like she's reclaiming something that was stolen from her at the altar. It's in this new life that she meets Rendy Sino, and I have to say, Rendy is written almost like a corrective fantasy for both Salma and the audience, a man who arrives not with grand gestures but with simple, consistent kindness. Rendy is initially just a colleague, someone she works with on a community project, but he takes note of her boundaries and respects them. He doesn't pry into her past when she clearly doesn't want to talk, and he pays attention to the things that matter to her in the present, her love for books, her habit of observing people quietly, her small, hesitant smiles. The chemistry between them is gentle, not explosive, and that's exactly what Salma needs, and what we, as viewers, need after the emotional onslaught of her marriage. Their romance is built in tiny moments. He brings her street food when she's too busy to eat, she helps him proofread a proposal, they argue playfully about movie endings, and slowly, we see Salma start to laugh without flinching, to walk without looking over her shoulder, to exist without constantly calculating what version of herself she's supposed to be. From a critical standpoint, some might argue that introducing Rendy turns the story into a love triangle, but I actually think it serves a deeper purpose in the narrative's exploration of healing and choice. Rendy represents a life where love is not entangled with contracts and obligations, where her name is just her name, not a mask. While Salma is learning to live again, Chris is learning, agonizingly, how to live with what he's done, and the show does not let him off easily. We see him trying to track her down, hiring private investigators, calling the Julia family, confronting Sarah for more details, but Sarah, in one of her most cutting lines, tells him, "You didn't look for her when she was in your house, why do you deserve to find her now?" And that lands like a slap not just to Chris, but to us, because it encapsulates that bitter truth. He had 3 years and countless chances to ask who she really was, and he wasted almost all of them. As he spirals, he becomes quieter, withdrawn, the once commanding CEO now going through the motions at board meetings, answering questions on autopilot while internally reliving every interaction with Salma. Noticing now the way she'd wince when he raised his voice, the time she waited for him to come home on their anniversary only for him to forget, the birthday gift she left on his desk, unopened for days, and the series uses these flashbacks strategically, not to torture the audience but to underline that memory itself has become his punishment. Whether you, personally, think that's enough is part of what makes talking about this show so interesting, because Pengganti Tiga Tahun doesn't spoon feed you a moral, it just lays out the emotional wreckage and invites you to decide how much grace you're willing to extend. When Chris finally does manage to find Salma, months later, after painstaking work, following breadcrumbs of information, he doesn't burst into her new life like some romantic hero in the rain. He just appears, one ordinary afternoon, on the street outside the community center where she works, and their reunion scene is one of the most quietly devastating encounters I've seen in a drama in a long time. Salma steps out, laughing at something Rendy just said, and her laughter dies mid-breath when she sees Chris standing a little distance away, older somehow, eyes tired, holding nothing but his own regret. The camera does this slow push-in on both their faces, and you can feel the weight of 3 years plus all the time since, hanging between them like something physical. Rendy, perceptive even in this moment, senses that this is not just some random acquaintance, and excuses himself, leaving them alone on the sidewalk where the sounds of traffic and life go on around them. Indifferent to their personal apocalypse, Chris tries to speak. Of course, he stumbles through her name, Salma, and the first thing she does is flinch, because there it is, her name on his lips for maybe the first time in their entire history, and the irony is almost too much. He apologizes, he says the words we expected, "I didn't know, I was wrong, I'm sorry," but the show doesn't let that apology become some magic eraser, because Salma stands there, listening with a face that is unreadable at first. Then slowly, we see this profound sadness settle in, and when she finally answers him, it's with a quiet strength that feels earned. "You are apologizing to someone you don't know," she tells him, and that one line cuts deeper than any angry tirade could have, because it forces him, and us, to confront the fact that loving someone in your own head doesn't mean you truly saw them. And here's where the controversial, gutsy choice of the show comes in. Salma tells him that she has moved on, that she has chosen to leave that part of her life behind, and that she is now with Rendy. But the important detail is that she doesn't say it to punish him, she says it as a fact, almost gently, and that gentleness hurts Chris more than cruelty ever could, because it means she has healed to a point where his existence no longer defines her. For some viewers, this was the moment they either loved or hated the series, because people who are used to redemption arcs that end in happily ever after for the original couple were torn. Should Salma go back to Chris now that he's realized his mistakes, or is her decision to stay with Rendy the more honest, healthier outcome? And this is where Pengganti Tiga Tahun shows its teeth as something more than just a melodrama, because it chooses not to make forgiveness synonymous with reconciliation. Salma does, eventually, forgive Chris, but she does not return to him, and the show treats that as a valid, powerful act of self-preservation rather than a failure of romantic destiny. She tells him, in perhaps the most important conversation of the series, that those 3 years will always be a part of her story, but they no longer get to define who she is or who she will be, and she thanks him for the few moments of genuine kindness he did give her, not because they outweigh the pain, but because acknowledging them allows her to close the chapter fully. Chris, left standing in that reality, doesn't fight her choice, and that restraint is what finally gives him a fragment of dignity. He realizes that any attempt to insist she belongs with him would just repeat the same cycle of erasing her agency, and so he lets her go, this time truly, not because he wants to, but because he has finally learned what it means to respect someone else's autonomy. As a viewer, it's heartbreaking, yes, because there is a part of you, the part trained by countless dramas and romances, that wants them to rewrite their story from the truth, to start over without lies, but another part of you, maybe the more mature part, knows that some damage can't be undone just by loving someone harder, that timing and choices matter, and that sometimes the bravest thing a character can do is walk away from the person they once thought they were destined to be with. Now, stepping back from the plot for a moment to talk about the broader cinematic and thematic qualities, Pengganti Tiga Tahun works so powerfully because it constantly plays with dualities, twin sisters and split identities, love and duty, punishment and protection, longing and letting go. The use of mirrors throughout the series is one of its most subtle yet effective visual motifs. We constantly see Salma reflected in mirrors as she adjusts her earrings, her wedding veil, her hair as Sarah, and later, as she stares at her shorter hair as Salma in her new apartment, and each reflection is framed differently, at different angles and distances, as if the camera is asking, "Who are you now?" Every time. In one particularly striking scene late in the series, after she's left Chris but before he finds her, Salma visits a photo booth with Rendy and they take silly pictures together, and when the strip prints out, the camera lingers on it lying on the table, a simple row of 4 images of her happy, unguarded face, and you realize with a jolt that we have never seen this version of her before, not in 3 years of marriage shots, not in any glossy family portrait. Thematically, the show is also very much about the cost of loyalty, especially within the context of family expectations. Both the Julia and Peter families treat their children as extensions of their reputations, and the series doesn't shy away from showing how corrosive that can be. Salma's mother, for example, is a complicated figure. On the one hand, she truly believes she is protecting her daughters and securing their future by making these arrangements, and she shows genuine remorse when she sees the toll it takes on Salma, but on the other hand, she still allowed it. She still asked her child to erase herself for the sake of the family, and the show never fully absolves her of that. There's this haunting exchange where, years later, after everything is known, she tries to apologize to Salma, choking up as she says, "I thought I was saving us," and Salma simply replies, "You saved everyone but me," and the silence after that line says more than any overt moralizing could. Similarly, Chris's father represents that old guard mentality that prioritizes legacy over love, and his scenes are intentionally uncomfortable. Every time he tells Chris to be a man and do what needs to be done, you see another layer of empathy being stripped away from his son, conditioning him to believe that vulnerability is weakness and that other people's pain is a necessary casualty of leadership. In contrast, Rendy's parents, when we eventually meet them, are warm, straightforward people who value their son's happiness over social alliances, and even though they don't have as much screen time, their presence offers a subtle but important alternative vision of what family can look like. From a pacing perspective, Pengganti Tiga Tahun takes its time, and whether you see that as a strength or a weakness will depend on your taste. Some viewers might find the middle stretch of the series a bit slow, especially as we sit in the grind of Chris and Salma's daily life, with many scenes of awkward breakfasts and tense dinner parties. But for me, that repetition is part of the emotional design. It makes you feel, on a small scale, the fatigue Salma feels, the way each day in that house stretches out, indistinguishable from the last except for the tiny shifts in warmth between them. And then, when the pace quickens in the final episodes, when the truth comes out, when departures and reunions happen, you feel the acceleration as almost disorienting, just as the characters do. Musically, the show leans into a melancholy score, lots of strings and piano, sometimes almost too on the nose, but there are moments where the music pulls back, leaving just the ambient sounds of a room, and those are the scenes that stuck with me the most. One example is that early balcony moment I mentioned, where the only sounds are distant traffic and the rustle of the night breeze as Chris wraps a blanket around Salma. No soaring violins, no manipulative swells, just the awkward sound of someone trying to care and not knowing how. In terms of audience reaction and cultural impact, Pengganti Tiga Tahun sparked conversations not just about romantic love, but about how far people in collectivist cultures are expected to go for their families, especially women. Online forums were full of comments from viewers saying things like, "My parents would totally do this," or, "I know someone who married for their family's sake," and while the specific scenario of twin impersonation is obviously heightened drama, the underlying themes hit uncomfortably close to reality. A lot of the discourse centered around Salma's decision at the end, staying with Rendy instead of returning to Chris, and you can almost chart generational and ideological differences in how people reacted. Younger viewers tended to champion her choice as empowering, praising the show for not rewarding Chris's late arriving remorse with a romantic prize, while some more traditional viewers felt unsatisfied, feeling that all the emotional investment into their complex bond was wasted if they didn't end up together. But that split is what makes this series linger in your mind, because it exposes the expectations we bring into love stories, that suffering must be worth it with a conventional happy couple, that abusers must be forgiven if they change, that the original pairing is sacred. Pengganti Tiga Tahun quietly, but firmly, pushes back against that, suggesting that healing is not always a circle back to where you started, but a line moving forward, even if that means walking away from something that once defined you. Performance-wise, the cast deserves a lot of credit for carrying such heavy emotional material without tipping it into melodramatic parody. The lead actress, especially, walks a tightrope between vulnerability and strength, and you never once doubt that Salma's choices are born out of deep internal struggle. Her scenes with Rendy feel different from her scenes with Chris, not just because of how the men treat her, but because of who she allows herself to be with each of them. Around Chris, particularly in the early years, she is cautious, always calibrating, choosing words carefully, reading his mood before deciding whether to speak. Around Rendy, she blossoms gradually, interrupting him, teasing him, even disagreeing openly, and watching that contrast is like watching someone come back to life. Chris's journey, on the other hand, is not about blossoming, but about decaying and then humbling. He starts the series polished, composed, tightly wound, and by the end he is a man who has been stripped of the illusions that justified his behavior. The actor conveys this through subtle physical changes, slumped shoulders, less eye contact, slower speech, and it's painful, but also honest, to see him live out a life shadowed by regret. The final scenes of the series show a quiet epilogue of sorts. Salma and Rendy at a small, intimate gathering, laughing with friends, the camera lingering not on some grand romantic gesture, but on her relaxed body language, her ease. Elsewhere, we see Chris sitting alone in his office, watching the city lights through the glass, a photo of the Peter board on his desk, but no personal photos, no hint of a domestic life. And when Sarah visits him one last time, now more mellowed by her own journey, she asks him if he ever found her, and he says, with a hint of a wistful smile, "I did, but she was already gone." And the scene cuts not to an image of Salma, but to a shot of her walking down a street with Rendy, from a distance, the two of them just small figures in a wide, bustling world, emphasizing that Chris is no longer the center of her story. As a final emotional summary, Pengganti Tiga Tahun is not an easy watch, but it's a rewarding one if you're willing to sit with messy emotions and imperfect people. It takes tropes we've seen before, the contract marriage, the mistaken identity, the cold husband, the gentle second lead, and twists them just enough to surprise you, not with plot twists, but with emotional choices that feel truer to the characters than to genre expectations. Its greatest strength lies in Salma's journey from being a replacement to reclaiming her own life, from being defined by a 3-year mission to defining herself beyond any timeline, beyond any man. It leaves you with questions rather than clean answers. How much should someone sacrifice for family? When does loyalty become self-betrayal? Can regret ever be enough, and is forgiveness always tied to reconciliation? And maybe the most haunting question of all, how many Salmas are out there in real life, living as someone else's replacement, their own name buried under duty and expectation? If you're the kind of viewer who wants your dramas to end with the original couple riding off into the sunset, this series might frustrate you. But if you're open to a story where the main romance is, ultimately, between a woman and her own autonomy, then Pengganti Tiga Tahun will stay with you long after the credits roll, its images of mirrors, letters, empty wardrobes, and quiet goodbyes replaying in your mind. It's the kind of show that makes you sit in silence after the final episode, thinking not just about what the characters did, but about what you would have done, whether you would have said yes like Salma, or run like Sarah, or realized too late like Chris. And that reflective space, that uncomfortable, introspective silence, is where this series really lives. And now, after walking through all of that together, from the wedding altar to the quiet streets of Salma's new life, I have to turn it back to you. If you were watching this along with me, if you felt those painful tugs in your chest, if you argued with yourself about who deserved what, then you know this isn't just a show you watch and forget. It's one you process, you debate, you revisit in your head when you can't sleep. And as we wrap up this long, winding, emotional unpacking of Pengganti Tiga Tahun, I'm left with one final thing to ask you, not as a critic to an audience, but as someone who loves stories that challenge us. There are love stories that begin with a whisper and a choice, and then there are stories like Pengganti Tiga Tahun, released in 2025, that begin with an avalanche you don't see coming, a quiet sacrifice made in a room full of people, a woman stepping into a dress that fits her body but not her name, breathing air that doesn't belong to her because it's the only way to keep two families from tearing each other apart. And as the camera settles on her eyes, on Salma Julia's steady but terrified gaze, you can feel the weight of the promise she's about to carry. You can feel her pulse in the tense silence between vows. You can feel the ache of a life she didn't choose beginning to unfold second by second. And there's something about the way this film begins that crawls under your skin, because it's not just a wedding, it's a transaction, a bridge built from a girl's spine, and the toll is paid in years. We're pulled in because we recognize the shape of duty even if we've never had to wear it like a mask, and when she looks at the man who will be her husband, Chris Peter, with a kind of hopeful dread, you realize that this isn't a story about a twist, it's a story about the after, the long stretch of time when you try to keep the lie from collapsing on top of you and everyone you love. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments. Now, here's the thing about a film with a title like Pengganti Tiga Tahun, which sounds like a deliberate mispronunciation of three, as if the word, tiga, had been softened by a secret or a superstition, as if even the number itself had to be disguised to protect someone's heart. The title tells you the contract up front, the way a lawyer slides paper across a glass table, and the story hands you the pen and says, look, this is the price. 3 years, that is all, and yet we know, don't we, that 3 years can be a lifetime if every day is measured in a tiny betrayal of the self, and that is why the background of this 2025 release feels important, because it arrives in a moment when audiences are hungry for melodrama that actually breathes, when the culture is ready to ask old questions with sharper edges, like how much do we owe to family, what's the cost of tradition, and who gets to decide when the debt has been paid. And the film slips into that conversation with the quiet assurance of a story that doesn't shout but still takes up space in your head long after the credits roll. It presents a marriage as a negotiated armistice between the Julia family and the Peter family, two households holding each other in a tense handshake, with Salma stepping forward as a stand-in for her twin sister Sarah, who vanishes into the shadows before the ceremony, leaving Salma to carry the torch, not because she's lesser but because she's willing, because she loves hard and believes that love can survive under other people's names. And in that first act, we get a performance that is all micro-expressions and withheld breath, the kind of acting where every small decision feels like a scaffolding holding back a flood. And Chris, God, Chris, is a beautiful tragedy from the moment he arrives on screen, not because he knows it but because he doesn't, because he's a man raised inside a fortress of his own certainty, a man who believes he's owed honesty and loyalty and tenderness but can't or won't give any of them when it matters. And that is the heartbreak that drives the film's engine. Watching a woman offer care to a man who can't tell the difference between her love and his own wounded pride. If you came to this hoping for a sweep you off your feet romance, the film plays fair with you. It gives you warmth but it earns it, and it does not flinch from the ugliness of what Salma endures, because in those early stretches she is hurt, emotionally and physically, and that's important to say out loud, because melodrama can sometimes glamorize cruelty in the name of passion, but here the cruelty is framed as the opposite of love. With the camera moving in and out of spaces like a wary friend who refuses to look away, giving us just enough distance to breathe, just enough closeness to feel the abrasion of every harsh word and each slammed door. And if you've ever been in a relationship that made you smaller, you might find yourself exhaling in tight little bursts as she tries to make tea, as she stares at a closed bedroom door, as she balances a china cup the way someone balances hope, lightly but with shaking hands, because she knows the cup will break if gripped too hard. When we talk about background and release details, this is not a film that arrives with 1,000 promotional fireworks. It lands like a note slid under your door, like a message you only read when you can't sleep, and it fits 2025 in a quieter, more daring way, because it respects the audience's intelligence and patience, trusting us to notice the textures of everyday survival, and it places that trust in the body language of its performers, in the way Salma holds herself at dinner tables. How her smile performs for elders and collapses as the camera drifts into the hall, how Chris fills a room with silence without ever raising his voice, and how Sarah's absence is a presence, a ghost who hasn't died, a name that lives in the space between two sisters who used to share a mirror. The story, in broad strokes, is simple, though nothing about it feels easy. Salma replaces Sarah to keep the fragile peace between the families. She marries Chris, who doesn't know her and can't love who he believes is a stranger living under the face of the woman he was promised. She spends 3 years in a house where she learns to be invisible and then remembers how to exist, and when she finally leaves, when the mission ends, as the film puts it, she steps out of the front door without a flourish, no swelling music, just the sound of her own feet finding ground again, and it is devastating in its gentleness. Then Sarah returns, and with her return comes the unmasking, the reveal that the woman Chris hurt was not the woman he thought he married. And the apology he didn't even know to issue turns into a pit he can't climb out of, because now he understands what he broke, and now he wants to rebuild it. But the film is not interested in rewarding regret with a ribbon and a kiss, because while he is searching, while he is retracing his steps and gripping at ideas of redemption, Salma is building a life with Rendy, who is not a prince or a savior but something better, a man who meets her where she is, who listens, who doesn't demand explanations for scars that aren't his to interrogate, and their scenes together have the easy rhythm of real conversation, the way you know someone is safe because you don't watch your every syllable for signs of danger, and the way hope sneaks back into a body that has learned to flinch. I'm not going to spoil every twist or every moment the film asks you to hold your breath, because this is a story that rewards watching with patience and a willingness to let subdued performances do the heavy lifting, but I want to talk about the impression these characters leave, because that's what stays after the credits. Salma is one of those protagonists who reminds you that strength is not spectacle, that surviving is not a montage of gym workouts and sharp comebacks, but a collection of unnoticed decisions, a posture learned in fear and relearned in joy, and the lead actress gives us a face that does more with a glance than some scripts can do with a page of dialogue. She radiates care even when no one is caring for her, and it's her belief in goodness, not naivete, that makes the cruelty burn, because she knows exactly what she's enduring and still tries to find the soft edges in the world, and when she leaves, it's not a triumphant exit so much as a refusal to keep shrinking. A beautiful, quiet no that reverberates louder than any shout. Sarah's role is a delicate one, because it would be easy to write her as a villain or a victim, but the performance navigates between those poles. Sarah is a sister with her own terror and her own regrets, and when she returns, she doesn't arrive to steal the spotlight, she arrives as the witness the truth needs, as the mirror that shows everyone what has been happening in plain sight, and her presence becomes a moral barometer, a reminder that the question is not which twin deserves Chris but which life deserves its own name back. The scenes between the sisters are tender and painfully honest, the kind of conversations that aren't asking for forgiveness so much as understanding, and you feel the years in the way they hug, in the hesitation of hands that used to hold without thinking. Chris is the hardest character to love and the hardest one to look away from. The actor brings a kind of brittle calm, the quiet vanity of a man who believes he's fundamentally decent because he doesn't see himself as a monster, and that quiet is what makes the sharpness cut when it appears, the anger that rises when his expectations are betrayed, the condescension that leaks out in phrases that sound like patience but feel like policing, and yet the film refuses to flatten him, his regret in. The final third is almost luminous in its sincerity, and you can see a man trying to become worthy long after the moment has passed, a man who's finally naming what he did wrong but can't get the one person who matters to hear him, because she doesn't owe him her attention or her time. And that is maybe the most radical gift this script gives us. It lets regret be the punishment instead of using a woman's body as a site of his redemption. Rendy, meanwhile, could have been a cardboard cutout of the nice guy, but the film sketches him with more care. He is not perfect, he is attentive, he makes mistakes and apologizes like a person, he gives Salma space and makes her laugh, and he is not jealous of the past because he's too busy showing up in the present, and their relationship is mapped in small, recognizable beats. The first inside joke, the first time she doesn't glance over her shoulder when she laughs, the first time he looks at her scars and understands that not all of them are visible, and those beats are scored not with big speeches but with pauses and everyday rituals, like picking a place for lunch and then walking slowly because the world feels new when no one is waiting to cut you down. The filmmaking itself leans into restraint without feeling anemic. You'll notice how the camera finds mirrors and windows and reflective surfaces, visual language for the twin motif that avoids cheap symbolism and instead invites us to think about what it means to see yourself and not recognize your own face, and we get a palette that evolves as Salma does, colder blues and grays in the Peter household, colors that feel like frost on a glass, giving way to warmer, grainier tones when she begins to step into her own life. Tones that look like sun on skin, not because the world is suddenly perfect, but because the temperature has changed, because the film wants us to feel the difference between a house and a home, and the editing respects time in a way that makes the 3 years believable. We get seasonal hints and time-lapse touches, but never in a way that feels like a gimmick, more like a diary that has recorded ordinary days with extraordinary care. I have to talk about sound, because it does a lot of emotional heavy lifting. In the early sections, you hear doors close and footsteps move down empty hallways, the kettle's quiet scream, the clock that ticks a fraction too loudly, reminding us that time isn't always healing. Sometimes it's just a metronome for endurance, and then, later, the score warms up without swelling into melodrama that tells you how to feel. Strings find a modest harmony, a melody that seems to exhale as Salma does. And in one of the film's loveliest touches, there's a moment when you can hear rain tapping against the window during a conversation that finally feels safe, and that tiny percussion section from the weather becomes a comfort, as if the world is telling her it can be soft. People will ask whether this story romanticizes suffering, and it's a valid question, and I think the answer lies in how the script frames consequences. There is no reward for enduring pain, no magical happy ending that suggests you must be broken before you deserve joy. The story names harm as harm and doesn't dress it up, and the only reward Salma gets is the one she carves for herself when she leaves, the reward of freedom, of possibility, of no, and the film goes further by refusing to punish her for not returning to the man who hurt her when he finally realizes what she meant. Love does not erase history here, and forgiveness isn't a switch flipped because a man is finally crying. If anything, the film's courage is in letting sorrow breathe without turning it into spectacle, in showing how regret can be a lifelong companion that isn't dramatic at all, just quiet and heavy, and that is what Chris is left with, the knowledge of himself, which can be the sharpest knife in the drawer. As for themes, the obvious one is identity. Of course it is, because twins are a natural metaphor for the question of who we are when the world insists on seeing us as someone else, but the film refracts that question through layers: family expectation, class, the invisible contracts of gender, and it asks what kind of survival we applaud, whether we only call it bravery if someone burns down a house, or if we can honor the courage of getting up and making breakfast every day when the house is already on fire and you're the only one who seems to smell the smoke. And it digs into duty, and what that word does to women, and whether the word love can be clean if it is soaked in duty's shadow. And the answer it offers is complicated and human, acknowledging that sometimes we do the wrong thing for the right reasons and the right thing for reasons we can't articulate, and we don't get tidy absolutions because tidy absolutions belong to fairy tales, not to lives that have to be lived one breath at a time. The performances sit on top of this thematic structure like facets on a gemstone. The actress playing Salma is a study in economy, giving us tremors instead of earthquakes, letting us see the decision trees behind her eyes, the calculation of risk in a smile, the way a body builds armor from manners. The actress playing Sarah threads guilt and love together without ever making guilt the louder note, so when she finally tells the truth, it sounds like music written in minor keys, the kind of music that doesn't ask you to dance, just to listen. The actor playing Chris uses his jaw like a weapon and his eyes like an apology. And that contradiction is exactly what the role demands, a man whose body has learned how to be imposing and who is only just learning how to be soft, not as a performance but as a person. The actor playing Rendy brings an ease that looks effortless but isn't, because it takes skill to be believable as a good man on screen in an era that rightly distrusts the trope, and he pulls it off by choosing smallness, small expressions of care, small moments of attention, which the film rewards by letting those small things accumulate into a life. Let's talk pacing, because melodrama lives or dies on whether you feel like you're floating or drowning. The film is deliberate without being dead, and that's harder than it looks. The scenes are given time to breathe but they don't meander, and the 3-year structure is a gift in that way, because it gives us both expansiveness and urgency, a countdown clock that never turns into a gimmick, a reminder that even when we let the camera linger on a teacup or a window, time is moving forward. And that movement gives the viewer this soft anxiety that matches Salma's inner life, and when she finally leaves, it's not because a big external event forces her hand, it's because the pacing has made you feel the sediment of tiny harms accumulating until standing becomes harder than stepping out, and that is powerful, because it trusts you to know why she's going without someone delivering a monologue about it. The cultural impact and audience reaction feel like a conversation you've been waiting to have, because when the film rolled out in 2025, it walked into a world that is becoming more fluent in the language of boundaries, more comfortable saying out loud that a relationship that requires you to vanish is not a relationship worth saving, and viewers responded with both gratitude and debate. Gratitude from people who saw their own quiet courage reflected back at them, who felt seen in a genre that often punishes women for choosing themselves, and debate from those who struggled with the idea that a man's remorse isn't enough, who wondered if the film is too harsh on Chris or too gentle with him. And that debate is the mark of a story that struck a nerve, because it means we're still learning how to assign language to harm and repair, and the film's refusal to give an easy answer might frustrate some, but it makes others ache with recognition. Online, people latched onto the phrase 3 years as a kind of shorthand, not just for the time Salma spent, but for any arbitrary limit we set on how long we're allowed to endure before we can leave, and that sparked threads of conversation about cultural norms, family duty, the weight of reputation, the worst-case scenarios of arranged marriages that start with love and end in control, and also the best-case scenarios in which families realize that what they owe their children is safety, not a deal. And because I love the craft of this thing, I want to break down a few moments, not in a way that spoils key beats, but in the way you talk to a friend who is about to watch and wants to know whether the film knows what it's doing. There's a scene early on where Salma is sitting at a dressing table, looking into a mirror that once belonged to Sarah, and the lights are too bright, and the bulb flickers, and for a second her reflection doubles, and what should be a cheap trick turns into an admission, like the film is confessing that it can't keep one face straight for very long, and I felt my stomach drop because it meant the story understood the stakes. Later, we get a shot of Chris's hand hovering over a door handle, not opening the door because he wants to leave or because he wants to enter, but because he doesn't know how to exist in the house he made, and the camera holds, punishing him with self-awareness more than the plot ever punishes him with external consequences, and near the end, there is a moment where Rendy and Salma are laughing about something small, something unmemorable, and the laugh goes on a second too long, not because it's staged but because relief is sometimes like that, it overruns the edges you set for it, and I swear the theater felt bigger, as if the screen had expanded by an inch, because joy opens spaces even when we don't know it. The sensitivity of the film extends to how it portrays the families, too. The Julias are not all saints and the Peters are not all devils, and that's the point, because institutions are made out of people who are just collections of their own fears and hopes. We see elders who think they're protecting and are instead preserving harm, and we see ones who learn, haltingly, how to choose their children over reputation. And the script knows that generational change is both a sprint and a crawl. Which is why those scenes don't resolve cleanly. They leave doorways open and conversations unfinished, which is, ironically, the most honest way to end a conversation about tradition. As the film moves into its final gesture, it refuses to give us a kiss as a reward or a punishment. It gives us space instead, space for Salma to choose, space for Chris to sit with himself, space for Sarah to live without the weight of having set this all in motion, space for Rendy to continue being a person and not a prize. And that quiet revolutionary ending might disappoint anyone who prefers stories to tidy themselves up, but for those of us who have learned to love films that respect life's mess, it feels like a blessing. The last images work like a breadcrumb trail leading back to the central questions, the way the title never stops asking you how long is long enough to trade your life away, the way replacing a person for a time is really impossible because when you let someone take your place you begin to dissolve at the edges. And then you have to find the pieces of yourself again. Performance-wise, the chemistry between these characters is fascinating because it isn't always sweet. Salma and Chris crackle not with attraction but with the friction of power imbalance, and the actor playing Chris uses that friction to build a portrait of a man who is half aware and mostly in denial, and it makes the regret later feel earned because it's consistent with someone who was never malicious but was always careless. Meanwhile, Salma and Rendy's connection gets built on open windows and friends' lunches and leaving the door ajar because secrets aren't the point anymore. And as a viewer, you realize how rare it is to see a romance that teaches you how to breathe instead of how to chase, and when you're finally breathing with them, that's when the film reminds you, gently, that breathing is not a promise either, it's just a human need that must be tended. Pacing and runtime always spawn commentary, and yes, there are moments where you might feel the length, but in a film about 3 years you should feel it, because the weight of a day can be enormous when you're waiting for a season to end. And the decision to let scenes live to the edge of discomfort is part of the point. The editing knows when to cut away from pain and when to let it sit, and I admired that balance, because we never get misery porn, and we never get rose-tinted recovery. We get what I can only call adult storytelling, responsibility without sermon, compassion without melodramatic indulgence. The cultural ripple of this film goes beyond the screen. You can feel it in the way people talk about the twin trope now, not as a gimmick for mistaken identity laughs but as a doorway to talk about how often women are asked to be interchangeable for the sake of other people's plans, and you can see its impact in conversations about what love looks like when it's not demonstrative, the difference between public gestures and private safety, the courage it takes to leave when leaving is the only way to keep living, and the mercy it takes to not go back just because someone finally sees you. And all of that happens without the film ever turning into a lecture, which might be its mastery. It moves your heart and then your mind follows. If you're wondering whether you should watch, here's my litmus test. If you've ever loved someone who didn't recognize the labor of your love until it was too late, if you've ever watched yourself become a version of you that you didn't know how to forgive, if you've ever learned, slowly and then all at once, that peace is not a luxury but a requirement, then this story will find you. It's not a fairy tale, it's better than that. It's a narrative that knows real life is less about getting what you want and more about learning to stop giving away what you need. I've talked at length about the film's gravity, but let me also honor its warmth, because there are images that feel like comfort food, like the shot of a hand resting on a tabletop, like sunlight refracting through a glass of water, like a jacket draped over shoulders in a parking lot with no grand pronouncements, like laughter erupting at a dumb joke because safety makes bad jokes funnier, and those images act like stitches, knitting the torn fabric back together, not erasing the tear but making it wearable again, which is, I think, the wisdom of this story's heart. In terms of the audience, people have feelings about Chris, and they should. Some will say he deserves a second chance because remorse is rare, and others will say remorse is the baseline, not a gift, and the film sits in that paradox with a painful grace. It lets him be fully human, which means he is not a monster and not a hero. And that's where redemption actually lives, if it lives anywhere, not in a swoop of reunion, but in a man deciding to become someone different even if no one is watching and even if no one applauds. And that quiet subplot plays out with the kind of patience that might grate on viewers who want something loud, but I found it to be the point, because sometimes the most moral thing a story can do is refuse to reward a person in order to honor the person they hurt. There's a possibility here, too, that some viewers will bristle at the way the film handles family reconciliation, because we're conditioned to expect elder characters to find the perfect words at the right time, to offer absolution that lands like a hymn. But the truth is that families rarely unspool their damage in one conversation, and so the film's choice to let apologies be imperfect and let forgiveness be partial feels like respect, a reminder that healing is not an event but an environment, and the environment has to be built, day after day, often by the same people who were injured, which is why Salma's leaving is so essential. She cannot build the environment she needs inside a house that required her to vanish, and the film doesn't blame her for refusing the role of architect, it blesses her for it. If we zoom out to talk about the film within the landscape of 2025 drama, you can see it as part of a larger wave of stories that are done asking for permission to center women's interiorities without bowing to the demand for a palatable narrative arc that ends in marriage. Instead, it begins with marriage and ends in a personhood, a narrative inversion that feels both fresh and timeless, and it stands shoulder to shoulder with the international conversation about what we do with men who are trying, who are late to their own wake, so to speak, and how we balance empathy with boundaries. The film doesn't offer a universal rule, but it models one way of doing it. You can see someone's humanity and still say no, and you can mean it, and everyone can survive your no, even if it hurts, and maybe that is the most romantic thing the film offers, a romance with oneself that doesn't require the ruin of anyone else. There are details I keep replaying because they feel like the sort of decisions only a writer who trusts the audience would make. The note that isn't read on screen because the point is not the words but the decision to write it, the hug that we only see from the hallway because intimacy is allowed to be private even in a film, the way Rendy's name is first said with caution and later with ease, the way Chris's full name is used when people want to remind him of his responsibilities and the way he says, Salma, like a confession when he finally realizes what he lost, the way Sarah touches a dress in a closet as if it were a museum piece, not to fetishize nostalgia but to acknowledge the artifacts of a life she didn't live but still feels with a phantom limb, and each of those choices contributes to the film's sense of realness, a realism that doesn't chase gritty details for their own sake but grounds its emotion in textures we recognize. I also appreciate how the script handles white space, not the literal kind on a page, but the emotional white space of what's left unsaid and undone, the silence after an apology, the pause before a door opens, the breath before the first kiss with Rendy that we don't see because it doesn't need to prove itself to us, and the silence when Chris sees Salma again as a different woman than he knew. The quiet that stretches not because the film is being coy but because it is letting time do what it does, which is to change the shape of us when we aren't looking. If you're listening to this and thinking about your own life, that's the sign of a story doing more than entertaining you, it's entering into you, and that's what Pengganti Tiga Tahun does with an elegance that might surprise you. Given how messy the subject matter is, it holds your hand through discomfort and doesn't yank, it lets you look away when you need to and then invites you back, and by the time the final image lands, you feel not just the end of a film but the end of a season of somebody's life, which is an entirely different kind of goodbye. As a verdict, as an emotional summary, here is what I think. This film is a quiet triumph of restraint, a melodrama that trusts nuance, an examination of identity that doesn't turn the twin device into a parlor trick, a love story that defines love as the presence of safety more than the presence of heat, and a moral drama that dares to make regret a destination instead of a bridge back to the status quo. It won't be everyone's cup of tea. Some will want the catharsis of a grand reconciliation. Others might wish for a harsher justice, but for many, I suspect, it will feel like a mirror held at the gentlest angle, showing us how soft the future can be if we let go of past roles, and how severe the past can be if we keep it close for comfort, and the best way to watch it is the way you would listen to a friend telling a story they've had to live through, without interrupting, with compassion, and with the willingness to accept the ending they chose even if you might have chosen differently, because only they know the rooms they had to walk through to get here. In the end, Chris's punishment is not exile or humiliation, it is knowledge, and that is fitting. Salma's reward is not a ring but a life, and that is correct. Sarah's gift is not absolution but truth, and that is necessary, and Rendy's role is not to save anyone but to be himself, which sometimes is the most radical job a character can have, to be ordinary in a world that loves spectacle. On a craft level, the film is handsome without being glossy, thoughtful without being ponderous, emotionally rich without being manipulative, and the performances are tuned to a frequency that will reward viewers who pay attention to hands and eyes and posture, which is to say, people who know that what we say is only half of what we communicate, and what we refuse to say is the rest. I left the theater feeling that slow, complicated fullness that doesn't make you run to your phone to tweet a hot take, but makes you want to call a friend and talk about the ways we give ourselves away and the ways we take ourselves back. I left thinking about how much of love is timing and how often timing is just a story we tell ourselves to avoid the harder truth that we didn't pay attention when we should have, and thinking about how, in the end, the only person who gets to title your story is you, even if, for a little while, you had to live under someone else's name. And that, for me, is why Pengganti Tiga Tahun matters, not because it's flashy or because it breaks 1,000 new storytelling rules, but because it remembers the oldest rule, the one about seeing people clearly and letting them choose, and it follows that rule all the way to the last frame, where the light doesn't bless anyone in particular. It just falls across a world that will keep spinning after all. These characters go home, which is exactly how it should be. If you're still here with me after everything we unpacked in the first part, then you already know Pengganti Tiga Tahun is not the kind of series you just watch and move on from. It's the kind of story that clings to the back of your mind days later. The kind of story where you're washing dishes or commuting to work and suddenly you remember a line Salma said, or the way Chris's face crumpled when he finally understood, and you find yourself arguing with imaginary people about whether any of it could have ended differently. And that's why I want to sink even deeper into it with you now, like we've just hit stop on the finale, sat there in stunned silence for a full 5 minutes, and then I turned to you and said, okay, we have to talk more, because there's so much in Pengganti Tiga Tahun that isn't obvious on the first watch, layers of character work, visual symbolism, small throwaway lines that mean more once you know the whole picture. And I don't know about you, but I love that feeling of going back through a story with new eyes, spotting the breadcrumbs the writers left for us like some emotional treasure hunt. And if in the first discussion we walked through the main road of the plot, this time I want to take you down the side streets, the little moments that define who these people really are, and the way the series builds its world around them, because one of the things Pengganti Tiga Tahun does so well is show how environment shapes emotion, how a house, a city, a family name can become characters in their own right, pressing down on our leads from all sides. Start with Salma, because this is, at its core, her odyssey, her transformation from a woman whose entire existence is built around asking, what do they need, into someone who finally allows herself to ask, what do I need? Think back to her very first scene in the series, before any talk of marriage, before any plot twists. We see her in the Julia house, right? Not center stage, but in the background, helping set out teacups while the adults talk about business in the living room, and the camera does this intelligent thing where it keeps her slightly out of focus while her mother, father, and Sarah are in sharp detail, and only when someone calls her name, asking her to bring something, does the focus snap onto her for a second, then back away. That's such a small detail, but it encapsulates how she's treated, important when needed, invisible otherwise. Rewatch that scene, knowing where she'll end up, and it hits totally differently, because you see a woman already trained to fade into the wallpaper, already rehearsing a lifetime of, yes, in small, harmless requests before being asked the one that will change everything. And when the crisis hits, Sarah gone, wedding looming, family about to implode, Salma's decision isn't born in that one moment of her mother begging. It's the culmination of years of being the one who smooths things over, of hearing, "You're the sensible one," like a curse disguised as praise. And I think a lot of viewers, especially from similar cultural backgrounds, felt that sting right away. So when you watch her standing in front of the mirror in the bridal room, veiled, makeup being adjusted by a flurry of hands, something inside you is already grieving, because it doesn't feel like a celebration, it feels like a ritual sacrifice. This quiet, resigned lamb being dressed up in lace and gold. What breaks me every time is the tiny beat where one of the makeup artists calls her back Sarah, and we see a flicker in Salma's eyes, that quick internal correction, "No, that's not my name," followed by her forcing herself not to react. The series never makes a big speech out of how painful it is to lose your own name, but it shows us in these micro-expressions, the way she freezes every time Sarah is thrown at her like a label, like a reminder that her actual identity has been shelved for the next 3 years. Contrast that to the first time someone in her new life after leaving calls her Salma, with warmth. Rendy, right? When they're in the middle of some community meeting and he laughs and says, "Salma, what do you think?" and she actually pauses for half a second, because hearing her own name, spoken so casually, so respectfully, is almost jarring after years of being "Bu Sarah," or "Mrs. Peter," and the series lets that moment breathe, letting the camera stay on her face as she absorbs the simple gift of being addressed as herself. If you're asking where the heart of Pengganti Tiga Tahun is, for me, it's in those details, the journey embedded in a name, the way a person's posture changes depending on what name they are answering to. In the Peter mansion, as Sarah, Salma holds herself tightly, shoulders slightly curved inward, voice always a little tentative, like she's afraid a wrong word will make the whole facade crack. But in that community hall with Rendy, as Salma, she leans forward when she talks, gestures more, allows herself to occupy space, and even if you muted the show and just watched her body language, you'd know when she's living as a borrowed identity and when she's finally living as herself. And speaking of borrowed identity, we have to talk more about Sarah Julia, the original bride who refused to be offered up. I think one of the boldest decisions the writers of Pengganti Tiga Tahun made was to resist making Sarah a one-dimensional villain, the selfish sister who runs away and leaves the good sister to pay her debts, because that would have been the easy route. It would have given us someone to hate without nuance. Instead, Sarah is infuriating, flawed, but also painfully understandable once we see her side. She grew up under the same family pressure as Salma, but reacted in the opposite way. Where Salma internalized it and became ultra-compliant, Sarah pushed back, questioned everything, and was labeled difficult for daring to want control over her own life. In flashbacks we see her arguing with their parents about the engagement to Chris, not just out of some shallow dislike, but because she doesn't want to be reduced to a bargaining chip. She talks about wanting to build something of her own, to leave the shadow of the Julia-Peter arrangement, and while her way of breaking free is messy and hurtful, disappearing without backup plans, letting everyone else deal with the fallout, there's a raw, chaotic honesty to it. What makes Sarah tragically compelling is that she's not around to witness what her escape costs Salma, and by the time she returns, the damage is irreversible. That scene where Sarah first learns the full extent of what Salma has endured in her place is one of the most emotionally loaded sibling confrontations in the series. They meet not in some dramatic, glamorous setting, but in a cramped kitchen of their parents' house. Years later, tension thick in the air, and when their mother finally blurts out the truth, how Salma married Chris, how she lived as Sarah for 3 years, how she left now with nothing, Sarah's bravado shatters. She turns to Salma with this look of pure horror, asking, "You did that for us? For me, and Salma, instead of exploding or sobbing, just gives this small, tired smile and says something like, someone had to, and in that moment, the weight of their shared and diverging choices crashes down on both of them. It's a brilliant writing choice that Salma doesn't unleash all her resentment here, because that's not who she is, but the hurt is there, braided into that resigned line. And Sarah's reaction, pacing, pulling at her hair, lashing out at their parents and herself, feels like all her suppressed guilt finally finding a crack to burst through. The relationship between the twins is one of the show's most under-discussed strengths, because it's easy to get caught up in the romance and forget that this is also a story about sisters who made radically different choices but were always stuck in the same cage. Their final conversation late in the series, after everything with Chris has collapsed, is a quiet masterpiece. They sit on Salma's new apartment floor, no furniture yet, eating instant noodles, and Sarah, eyes red, admits that for the first time, she envies Salma, not for the suffering she endured, obviously, but for the strength it took to survive it and still be capable of love after, to choose Rendy and a new life instead of being dragged forever by their family's gravity. Salma, in turn, admits she envied Sarah's ability to say no, to run, to refuse being used, even if she paid a different price for that. It's this mutual confession of envy and love that finally equalizes them, not the same choices, not the same scars, but both deserving of empathy. Now, pivot to Chris Peter, because we need to sit with him a bit longer, not to justify everything he's done, but to understand the architecture of his loneliness. If Salma's first scene shows her slightly out of focus in the background of her own family, Chris's first introduction is almost the opposite. We see him in full, evaluative close-up in a boardroom, surrounded by people who defer to him, his every word taken as directive, his posture screaming control. But there's something immediately off, a kind of emptiness in the way he nods, the perfunctory smile that never reaches his eyes, and the series makes it clear from minute one that this is a man who's been performing competence for so long that he's forgotten what it feels like to relax. We get glimpses into his backstory, snatches of conversation with his father about the legacy, about never showing weakness, and a heartbreaking flashback of him as a teenager, coming home from school, clearly upset about something, only to be told, "We don't have time for your feelings, there's a meeting," and dragged along to sit in a corner while adults talk numbers over his head. That mold, where emotional needs are dismissed as inconvenient, produces the Chris we meet in the present, successful, composed, and emotionally stunted. So when he enters into an arranged marriage with Sarah, he doesn't see it as a romantic union at all. He sees it as another contract, another bullet point on the checklist of what a good heir does, and that's why he allows himself to be cruel at first, because he doesn't see Sarah as a person who might be fragile or hurting. He sees her as an obligation he's been trapped into, a representative of the Julia family that has, in his mind, already wronged him. That's what makes his arc both infuriating and, in a painful way, psychologically coherent. Pengganti Tiga Tahun never suggests that trauma is an excuse for abuse, but it does show how untreated emotional wounds mutate into harmful behaviors, and if anything, Chris's journey becomes a cautionary tale about what happens when you're taught that love is transactional and vulnerability is a liability. Pay attention to the way he handles conflict in those early years of the marriage. He avoids, deflects, hides in work, or snaps in short, controlled bursts, then retreats again, like a man who has never learned how to have a real argument about feelings, only power. One scene that really crystallizes this for me is the night when Salma accidentally breaks an old glass decanter that belonged to his mother. On the surface, it's a small accident, something that could happen to anyone, but Chris explodes, shouting things like, "You don't care about anything that matters to me," projecting his unresolved grief onto her. And the camera stays on Salma's face as she shrinks under his words, even though we know she's the kind of person who probably feels worse about what happened than he does. Later, much later, when he's sitting alone in that same room after she's gone, he picks up another fragile object and you can see the regret flicker in his eyes as he remembers that night, realizes he chose a piece of glass over her emotional safety. Scenes like this are what make his eventual regret so crushing, because it's not one grand sin. It's 1,000 micro-cruelties that add up. Whether you personally feel he ever truly earns redemption is up to you, but from a storytelling standpoint, the show makes an interesting choice. It allows him to change, but doesn't reward that change with getting the girl back, which in itself is a bold statement about how growth is valuable even if it doesn't lead to a happy ending. Often in fiction, a character like Chris would go through a redemption arc primarily as a means to secure the romance. Look, he's changed, so he deserves her now. But Pengganti Tiga Tahun refuses that transactional logic. Instead, his growth is framed as something he owes to himself and to the world, not as a down payment on Salma's forgiveness. And speaking of forgiveness, the show's approach to it is surprisingly mature. Salma's journey toward forgiving Chris is not linear, not comfortable, and crucially, not done for his benefit. By the time she looks him in the eyes and says, "I forgive you, but that doesn't mean I can go back," she's doing it to set herself free from the past, to remove the last hook of resentment from her heart, not to give him closure wrapped in a bow. This distinction between forgiving someone internally and reconciling with them externally is something media often glosses over, and I think a lot of viewers, especially those who have dragged themselves out of toxic relationships in real life, found that distinction incredibly validating. Please note how the lighting and framing in that forgiveness scene emphasize her agency. They are not in some nostalgic location tied to their marriage. They are in a neutral open space, a park bench in the afternoon, with natural light instead of the heavy, shadowy interiors of the Peter mansion, and the camera keeps them in a wide shot for much of the conversation. Equal distance, equal presence, no one towering over the other. Visually, the power imbalance that defined their marriage has been recalibrated, and that makes her words land with a calm finality that you don't need soaring music to underline. Now, let's bring Rendy into sharper focus, because if Chris is the storm Salma barely survives, Rendy is the harbor she sails into afterward. And that's not to say he's perfect, no one in this show is, but he represents a different model of masculinity, one not based on control or protection through dominance, but on partnership and respect. When we first meet him, he doesn't sweep in like a knight in shining armor. He's just this mildly dorky, good-natured guy joking about how bad the coffee is at the community center, bumping elbows with her as they both reach for the sugar, and the series makes a point of not scoring their early interactions with romantic music. These are just two people who happen to click as co-workers, then as friends. I love that for several episodes they don't even tease a romance, they let the connection grow organically through shared tasks and conversations. One of my favorite Rendy moments is so small you might miss its importance on a first watch. He comes to pick Salma up for a work event and waits outside her building, texting, "I'm downstairs when you're ready," and when she's late, he doesn't call 15 times or get impatient. He just sits there, scrolling his phone, and when she arrives, slightly out of breath and apologizing for keeping him waiting, he casually says, "It's okay, we're fine on time," and you get the sense he would have waited an hour without making her feel guilty. Contrast that to early Chris, who would tap his watch, sigh loudly, weaponize lateness as proof of disrespect. Rendy's steadiness becomes even more impactful once he learns about Salma's past, the way he responds to the revelation that she was once married to a powerful man, that she lived under another name, is a litmus test of his character, and the show passes him with flying colors. He doesn't freak out, he doesn't accuse her of lying to him, he just quietly absorbs it and says, "You don't owe me the parts you're not ready to share, but thank you for trusting me with this." And there's a shot of Salma's face in that moment, eyes filling with tears, because it might genuinely be the first time someone has treated her vulnerability as a gift, not as leverage. That's when the audience starts to think, okay, this guy is not just a narrative obstacle to the endgame couple, he might be the endgame, full stop, and the writers lean into that possibility beautifully, giving Rendy his own small arc, not about trauma or old wounds, but about learning how to love someone who has been hurt without trying to fix them. In a conversation with a friend, he admits he sometimes wants to rush Salma, to pull her fully into his life and theirs together, but that is learning patience, understanding that her hesitation isn't about him being lacking, but about her needing time to truly believe she's safe. This awareness, this emotional literacy, is something almost no one in Salma's life had before, and it's one of the reasons so many viewers fiercely defended her decision to choose him. Now, stylistically, Pengganti Tiga Tahun also distinguishes these two relationships through color and space. Scenes with Chris are often bathed in cooler tones, steely blues, muted grays, reflective surfaces, whereas scenes with Rendy lean into warmer palettes, sunlight, earthy colors, bustling outdoor locations. It's not subtle, but it's effective, and the contrast builds subconsciously, so by the time we're in the final stretch, your body almost knows which man she should be with before your mind has even formed the argument. When she stands next to Chris, especially in the mansion, there's always some physical barrier between them, a table, a desk, a doorway, something framing them apart. But with Rendy, the blocking is more open. They sit side by side, shoulders brushing, facing the world together rather than each other across a gulf. that visual storytelling reinforces the emotional truth that one relationship is about surviving within a structure, and the other is about building something new on equal footing. Moving out from the main quartet, I also want to acknowledge how the supporting cast enriches the narrative tapestry. Chris's father, for instance, could have been a straightforward tyrant, but the actor plays him with just enough softness at the edges that you catch flashes of the man he might have been if he'd been born into a different system. There's this late series scene where he watches Chris from a distance, notices his son's withdrawn demeanor, his haunted expression, and for a brief moment, he looks like he wants to go to him, to say something fatherly and comforting, but then his face hardens, and he walks away, defaulting back into the role of patriarch, not parent. It's a small tragedy nested inside the larger one, a generational chain of emotional neglect that the show is quietly critiquing. Similarly, Salma's mother isn't a cartoonishly evil matriarch. She's a woman crushed by her own fears and class anxieties, someone who made terrible choices out of a conviction that there was no other way. There's a key flashback where we see her younger, looking around a modest rented room, holding baby Salma and Sarah, crying because she's terrified of not being able to give them security, and when an opportunity arises years later to bind their family to the wealth and power of the Peters, she jumps at it like a drowning person reaching for a rope, not realizing the rope is tied to an anchor. That doesn't excuse what she asks of Salma, but it complicates our moral judgment. I think Pengganti Tiga Tahun is very aware of how poverty and status anxiety can push good people into complicity with harmful systems, and by showing us these character backstories, the show invites us to criticize the structures without dehumanizing the individuals entirely. And then there's the wider social circle, the gossipy relatives, the snide socialites at business galas, the Peter Company board members. All of them serve as mirrors reflecting the central tension between public image and private truth. I love how often we see characters putting on their public faces in these settings, especially Salma, who early on is clearly out of her depth among the slick, PR-trained spouses of CEOs and directors. Remember that charity luncheon where one of the other wives, with a sugar-coated smile sharp as glass, asks Sarah when she's planning to have children, hinting that an heir would solidify her position in the Peter family. And Salma almost chokes on her tea because up till that point, no one in her own family had really discussed the implications of children in this fake marriage. The writers wisely avoid going down a pregnancy plotline, which would have made everything even more explosive, but that moment serves to highlight another layer of stakes, the potential future that could have bound her to this lie permanently. Fortunately, or tragically, depending on your perspective, the marriage ends before such complications arise, but the mere suggestion is enough to send a chill down your spine. Structurally, Pengganti Tiga Tahun also excels at using parallelism between the 3 years era and the post-marriage era. For example, there's an early episode where Salma, as Mrs. Peter, attends a company anniversary party, standing awkwardly by the balcony, watching Chris work the room, and later, in the new timeline, we see her attending a small celebration for the completion of the community project with Rendy, again standing by the edge of a crowd, but this time she's drawn into the center by her own choice, not as someone's accessory. Moments like that visually and narratively underline her evolution, from observer to participant, from someone whose presence is defined by others to someone who chooses where to stand. Even the motif of 3 years itself is woven smartly into the show. It's not just a number, it's almost a spell that characters repeat until it becomes a psychological boundary. Salma tells herself, 3 years, just 3 years, like a prisoner counting down a sentence. Her mother reminds her, it's only for 3 years, like that makes the sacrifice less devastating. Chris treats it as a vague, undefined period he doesn't think too deeply about, assuming everything will just continue afterward if he chooses. But time, in Pengganti Tiga Tahun, is not neutral, it's an active force that erodes illusions. By the end of those 3 years, no one is who they were at the start, and that's why the contract's expiration is less a clean exit and more a tectonic shift. Salma walks away, yes, but she doesn't step back into the same life she left, nor do the families simply revert to their pre-arrangement status quo. The Peter-Julia alliance is technically intact, but emotionally shattered, and the show smartly resists tying everything up with a neat business bow. We get hints that the companies continue working together in some capacity, but the personal relationships are irrevocably altered, and that feels true to how such high-stakes entanglements actually work. On a meta level, it's also interesting to consider how Pengganti Tiga Tahun fits into the broader landscape of 2020's Asian melodrama. We've seen a wave of contract marriage and fake relationship narratives from Korean, Chinese, and Thai dramas. But what makes this Indonesian take stand out is its emphasis on lasting consequences and the refusal to romanticize suffering as a straight line to happiness. In a lot of stories, the pain is framed as necessary seasoning for a sweeter end reward. They hurt each other, but look how in love they are now. And while that can be entertaining, it's refreshing and honestly challenging to see a narrative say, no, some wounds don't create stronger bonds, they create scars that are better left in the past. Pengganti Tiga Tahun taps into familiar tropes. Yes, the cold male lead, the poor but kind-hearted female lead, the second male lead, the interfering families, but it interrogates them instead of just reenacting them. What happens when the cold male lead stays cold for too long? What happens when the kind-hearted female lead finally, truly gets tired? What happens when the second male lead is not a consolation prize, but a genuine, viable source of love and stability? And perhaps most subversively, what happens when the big, dramatic truth reveal, the discovery that Salma is not Sarah, doesn't serve as the reset button for a new, better romance, but rather as a mirror forcing everyone to see the ugliness of what they've allowed to happen? That truth reveal scene stays with me, not just for Chris's reaction, but for Sarah's trembling mix of guilt and anger. And here's a detail that's easy to miss. When Chris asks, "Why didn't anyone tell me?" there's a bit where Sarah could say, "Because we didn't trust you," but instead she says, "Would it have changed anything?" And the silence that follows is damning, because deep down, we know that early series Chris might have just channeled his rage at being deceived into even harsher treatment of Salma, or used the revelation as an excuse to annul the marriage and toss her aside even sooner. It's only the Chris shaped by 3 years of accidentally falling for her, despite himself, despite the name he kept using, that could stand there now and say, "I was wrong," and mean it. The tragedy is that his growth arrives just a little too late for their paths to converge again. From an audience engagement standpoint, this timing fueled endless debates online. Some viewers argued that because he did eventually realize his mistakes and change, he deserved a second chance with Salma, while others countered that the whole point was that growth is not a transaction and that Salma's right to peace should not be compromised to fulfill his redemption arc. Reading those comment threads felt like watching a live seminar on boundaries, trauma, and the ethics of forgiveness, and in that sense, Pengganti Tiga Tahun became more than just entertainment. It sparked necessary conversations. In terms of filmmaking technique, another standout element is the use of silence. In so many melodramas, emotional scenes are underscored by swelling scores that practically tell you when to cry. But this series frequently does the opposite, stripping the soundscape down to diegetic noises and letting the actors' breathing and pauses carry the weight. Remember the moment after Salma tells Chris she's with Rendy now? The camera lingers on his face, his mouth slightly open, eyes glistening, and instead of music, we hear distant traffic, birds, maybe a dog barking somewhere. The world going on, uncaring, and that mundane background makes his personal devastation feel more real. It's not framed as some operatic tragedy the universe itself is witnessing. It's just a man realizing, in the middle of an ordinary day, that a chapter of his life is truly over. Similarly, when Salma sits alone in her small new apartment the first night after leaving, there's almost no sound but the hum of the fridge and occasionally a car passing by outside, and the lack of score makes her quiet breakdown, tears streaming as she clutches her own arms, feel painfully intimate, like we're intruding on a private moment we shouldn't be seeing. Even the way the camera frames the Peter mansion changes once she's gone. Earlier in the series, when she first moves in, we see the house in grand establishing shots, huge and imposing, but filled with activity. Staff move around, guests arrive, there's a sense of bustling, high society life. After her departure, the mansion is filmed emptier, echoing, the sound design emphasizing footsteps on marble, doors closing with hollow thuds, and for the first time, it looks less like a palace and more like a very expensive cage. And maybe that's the deepest magic trick Pengganti Tiga Tahun pulls off. By the end, the dream life that so many side characters envied, the rich husband, the luxury home, the powerful in-laws, has been so thoroughly deconstructed that when we see Salma in a modest, sunlit rental with second-hand furniture, we feel relief, not pity. Emotionally, the richest place in the series is not the Peter estate. It's that little apartment where she and Rendy host friends on the floor because they don't have enough chairs yet, where laughter bounces off bare walls and takeout boxes double as plates. If you think about how many traditional melodramas equate material wealth with a happy ending, that's a quietly radical shift. And as much as this series lives and dies on its emotional authenticity, it's also worth noting how well it's paced for a weekly release drama. The writers know when to give us payoff and when to hold back. They understand that tension doesn't always come from big reveals, but often from holding two characters in a room together with unspoken history simmering under every line. The early episodes build that tension between Chris and Salma slowly, almost torturously, and some viewers might have screamed at their screens, "Just talk to each other." But that inability to talk is precisely the point. In a household where honesty would upend the whole arrangement, silence becomes the currency of survival, and we feel that. Then, later, when Salma is with Rendy and conversations flow easily, even about difficult topics, it feels like an almost luxurious freedom. All of this circles back to one simple but profound idea: love without safety is not love, it's captivity. And Pengganti Tiga Tahun spends its entire run guiding us to that realization, even if it means denying us the conventional comfort of seeing the original couple ride off into the sunset. So, as we sit here together, having pulled apart the layers of Salma's sacrifice, Sarah's rebellion, Chris's downfall, and Rendy's steady warmth, maybe the question we're left with is less, who should she have ended up with, and more, who do we become when everything we've been taught about duty, family, and love is stripped away? If Salma, the quiet one, the dependable one, the girl who could be bent for 3 years without breaking, can eventually stand up and say, "No more, I choose myself," then maybe this story is whispering to anyone out there who feels like a replacement in their own life, anyone who has been told their worth lies in what they can do for others. Your time doesn't have to be measured in sacrifice, your name doesn't have to be a mask, and your happy ending doesn't have to look like what anyone else imagines for you. You're allowed to walk away, you're allowed to heal somewhere new, you're allowed to forgive without returning, and you're allowed to build a love story that starts with loving yourself. That's what makes Pengganti Tiga Tahun linger, not just as a tragic romance, but as a quietly revolutionary tale about reclaiming your own narrative. And if you've made it this far with me in this deep dive, sitting with these characters and their choices, turning them over like stones in your hands, then you know we could probably talk for hours more about specific scenes, about the OST lyrics that hit a little too hard, about the way certain lines echo across episodes like emotional boomerangs, always coming back at the worst possible time. And if you want, we absolutely can keep going, because stories like this don't really end when the credits roll, they just keep unfolding in the way we remember them, the way we argue about them, the way we see ourselves and our own lives reflected in them. Which brings me right back to that question I left you with last time and that I can't resist asking again, now that we've gone even deeper into the world of Salma, Sarah, Chris, and Rendy.